Welcome to an introduction to gross brain topography. In this session, we'll differentiate between components of the central and peripheral nervous system, define the terms gray and white matter, and differentiate between them, review the planes of orientation for both the brain and the brainstem, define the anatomical boundaries of each of the lobes of the cerebral cortex, identify the major gyri associated with each lobe, and then associate general functions with each region or gyrus of the cerebral cortex. We'll then identify the subdivisions of the brainstem and associate cranial nerves with particular regions of the brain or the brainstem. The neuron is the structural and functional unit of the nervous system. As you know, components include the cell body of the neuron, dendrites, and an axon. And the axon is often covered by myelin. In the central nervous system, it's covered by myelin provided by oligodendrocytes. In the peripheral nervous system, it's covered by myelin provided by Schwann cells. These two different kinds of myelin have a different chemical constitution, and as a result, they're susceptible to different kinds of diseases. The output of that neuron is generally at a synapse or at a neuromuscular junction or onto a gland. We can see the oligodendrocyte here for the central nervous system and the Schwann cell here for the peripheral nervous system. The nervous system is divided into two parts: the central nervous system, that includes the brain and spinal cord, which are encased within the skull and in the vertebral column. And then the peripheral nervous system, which is all of these nerves outside of the CNS, connecting the central nervous system to the various body parts. It includes cranial nerves, spinal and peripheral autonomic nerves, ganglia, and sensory receptors. Note that the cranial nerves are those that emerge either from the brain or the brainstem. The subcomponents of the CNS include the brain, which is divided into the cerebrum, which includes the two cerebral hemispheres, the thalamus, which is deep to the cerebrum, and hypothalamus, which is just below the thalamus, the brainstem, which is made up of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, and the cerebellum, which is attached to the brainstem, particularly to the pons. And then we see the spinal cord below. On an inferior portion of the brain, view of the brain, we can see the connection of cranial nerves to the brain. And the olfactory nerve, which is pulled off because it's attached to the cranium and olfactory mucosa, we see the olfactory bulb, which receives input from cranial nerve 1. And then the optic nerve, cranial nerve 2, we see right here coming into the optic chiasm and going up through the optic tract into the brain. And then we see the cranial nerves that are directly attached to the brainstem, and that is cranial nerve 3, which comes from the midbrain, cranial nerve 4, which also comes from the midbrain, cranial nerve 5, which comes from the lateral pons, cranial nerve 6, which we see at the pontomedullary border, cranial nerve 7 and 8, which also come from the pontomedullary border, and then cranial nerves 9, 10, and 11, which come from the lateral portion of the medulla, and cranial nerve 12, which comes off of the medulla in between the pyramids and the olive. The cortical gray matter can be seen on this lateral view of the cerebrum, and everything we're looking at is cortical gray matter. And we also see cortical gray matter on the cerebellar surface. During development, the amount of cortex grows dramatically and extends so much that the cortex ends up having this corrugated appearance, and The hills are gyri, and the crevasses between them are sulci on the cerebrum. In the cerebellum, the hills are called folia. And as we said, between the gyri are sulci on the cerebrum, and there also are deeper grooves that are called fissures. And we'll see two major fissures, and that is the central fissure and the lateral fissure. Because of this corrugated appearance, it turns out that 2/3 of the cerebral cortex is within those sulci. So we're only looking at about 1/3 of the cell bodies in the gray matter at their surface. If we were to dissect away that gray matter, we can see subcortical white matter, and it includes large numbers of axons that travel either from the cortex deep to distant places in the spinal cord or between different portions of the cortex. We see the corticospinal tract depicted here in red. If we look at a horizontal section of the brain, stained so that gray matter is purple and white matter is white, we can see the cortical ribbon, which is about 4 or 5 millimeters in thickness, the subcortical white matter, but then we see a variety of structures deep in the brain referred to as nuclei. They are collections of cell bodies in which there are common functions that that particular region carries out. This is the caudate nucleus is one. We also see a variety of nuclei within the thalamus. We can also see white matter that is a commissure between the two hemispheres, and that is the corpus callosum. There's terminology of several different terms used to describe white matter. The long tracts are often referred to as pathways or tracts, and they're very large numbers of neurons that go a long distance. And we've already talked about those, the corticospinal tract, the spinal thalamic tract, and others include the dorsal column or niscal pathway. There are also a variety of other structures that we'll refer to as we go through this course. And one of those is fasciculi, little bundles. We've seen fasciculus gracilis, fasciculus cuneatus, part of the dorsal columns. We'll see the funiculi, they're strings. They're regions of white matter that include a number of different pathways. There are peduncles, groups of white matter that refer to little feet that you'll see bulging out of a portion of the brain, a brain stem in particular. Lemnisci, which are ribbons of white matter that we'll see, such as the dorsal column medial lemniscus is one of those. The columns that we referred to, the dorsal columns for sensory information, and then a variety of other projection terms. Decussations are axon bundles that cross the midline, going from one location to a different location on the opposite side of the nervous system. Commissures are axon bundles that travel from one side of the nervous system to the other to similar locations, and the classic one of those is the corpus callosum. Efferent fibers are those leaving one location and projecting to another, such as the corticospinal tract is an efferent fiber from the cortex to the spinal cord. An afferent fiber is a collection of fibers that are entering into a region, so that the spinal thalamic pathway is afferent to the thalamus. Modality refers to the type of information, the quality of information that's carried within the pathway. It's a defining feature of the function of those particular neurons. It's most commonly used in the sensory pathways to show the sensitivity of a group of neurons to a particular stimulus associated with specialized receptors in the periphery usually. And examples include pain receptors, temperature, touch, deep pressure, and proprioception, as well as kinesthesia, the perception of movement at a joint. All of these are dependent on specialized receptors peripherally, but that information is preserved and modified in interesting ways as we move centrally. The planes for orientation are represented in this figure, and they show that if you were to split the two hemispheres in half at the midline, you're creating a sagittal section. That's a sagittal plane. It divides the brain in half from left to right. Just off, if you move a few centimeters away from that sagittal plane, but parallel to it, then you produce a parasagittal plane. So you might look at the brain in parasagittal planes. Orthogonal to this sagittal plane, we see here the frontal or coronal plane, and it separates the anterior from the posterior portions of the brain, and that coronal plane can be taken, coronal sections can be taken at various locations from the anterior to the posterior axis of the brain. Orthogonal to both of these planes is the horizontal or axial plane, in which superior and inferior portions of the brain are separated. And again, you could have horizontal sections at any level of this brain to show the internal components of the brain. The directional terms vary at different locations within the nervous system, so that in the brain, rostral is the anterior portion of the brain, and caudal is the more posterior portion of the brain. And dorsal is the more superior portion of the brain, and ventral is the more inferior portion of the brain. Because of a substantial bend in the axis between the brain and spinal cord at the brainstem, the terminology differs here, so that rostral is the more superior portion of the spinal cord, and caudal is the more inferior portion of the spinal cord, and dorsal is the posterior portion of the spinal cord, and ventral is the anterior spinal cord. If we look at the images that are used routinely in radiologic imaging, we'll recognize that if you take a coronal section, that is a coronal section through the brain, we can see the brain in A and B, so that the vertex is represented near the top, and the neck and the brainstem is located lower down. If we were to take a horizontal section or an axial section through the brain, we see that an anterior portion of the brain is represented on top, and the most posterior portion or caudal portion of the brain is located on the bottom. If we look at a sagittal section, we can see the structures on the midline, and we can see the frontal region here and the occipital region here, and we can see the corpus callosum represented here, as well as the brainstem. And we see here a parasagittal section that is simply a short distance off of the mid-sagittal region. Now, there's a clinical radiological convention for both CT and MRI images, and that's shown here. And that is, they're taken as if you are viewing the individual patient from standing at the feet of the patient and looking up towards the head, and with the patient on their back in a supine position in the scanner. In this case, what you're looking at on your left is actually the right side of the brain, as you can see for this individual. Similarly, what you're looking at on the left of both the coronal and of the axial, what you're looking at on your left is the right side of the brain. And also, what you're looking at most superiorly, this is actually the anterior portion of the brain, and what you're looking at on the bottom is the posterior portion of the brain. So the image is reversed left and right relative to what you commonly think about in anatomical terms. If we look at the anatomical topography of the cortex, we can see that from this left hemisphere, we see the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. And these are separated by a couple of major sulci that we see, or fissures, and that's the lateral fissure and the central fissure, or central sulcus. If we look at the mid-sagittal section, in this case with the frontal lobe looking to the right, then we see the frontal cortex, the frontal lobe, we see the parietal lobe, we see the occipital lobe, and we can see the temporal lobe, even though the temporal lobe is not actually on the midline. It's off the midline, but we can see it under the rest of the brain. And we also see something that's referred to here as the limbic lobe, but you'll recognize that this will be described as the cingulate gyrus, and it represents other kinds of functions. We can also see the corpus callosum, which is a major commissure between the right and the left hemisphere. And then there is an insulobe buried deep in the lateral fissure that we'll take a look at shortly. And we can see that here. If we take the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe in a fixed or fresh specimen, and we separate out the frontal and temporal lobe along the lateral fissure, we can see buried deep inside the insular cortex. It has smaller gyri, and we can see the region just around that insular cortex is referred to the frontal, parietal, and temporal opercula, opercula referring to coverings. If we look at the lateral surface, we can see that the central sulcus is a key landmark for identifying various structures in the brain. We're looking at the left hemisphere here on the lateral surface. And the central sulcus separates two major gyri and tends not to come down all the way to the lateral fissure. The lateral fissure is a very deep fissure, and it separates the temporal and the frontal lobes. You see here the frontal lobe, we see the frontal pole, we see the parietal lobe, we see the occipital lobe and the temporal lobe, and we also see the cerebellum. The frontal and temporal are very clearly separated by the lateral fissure. The parietal and frontal very clearly separated by the central fissure. These are not so obvious, but as we'll see, there are ways of identifying as we move from the posterior edge of the lateral fissure to a borderline between the occipital lobe and the parietal lobe. We will see on the midline that there's a very well-defined separation of this region between occipital and parietal lobe. It'll help to define this margin. Here we see a cranial nerve cavity that shows the anterior cranial fossa, where the frontal lobe sits, the middle cranial fossa, where the temporal and occipital lobes sit, and the posterior fossa, cranial fossa, where the cerebellum sits. Covering the cerebellum is the tentorium cerebellum. It's essentially a tough membrane covering the cerebellum, separating it from the occipital lobe that sits here. Some of the gyri that we'd like to recognize, again, starting out with the central sulcus, immediately anterior to that is the precentral gyrus. Anterior to that are various frontal gyri, the superior frontal gyrus, the middle frontal gyrus, and the inferior frontal gyrus. The inferior frontal gyrus is broken up into three different components: the triangular gyrus, the opercular gyrus, and the orbital frontal gyrus. Orbital frontal is just over the orbit. If we look at the parietal lobe, we can see immediately behind the central sulcus is the post-central gyrus. And then posterior to that is the superior parietal lobule. And inferior to that is the supramarginal gyrus and the angular gyrus, which together make up the inferior parietal lobule. As we come down to the temporal lobe, we see the superior temporal gyrus, the middle temporal gyrus, and the inferior temporal gyrus. The cerebral cortex has separate functional areas. Different parts of the brain do very different things. The primary sensory areas receive sensory input from the body, that is, a somatosensory input from the eyes for vision and from the ears for audition. And as we'll find out later, also from the nose for olfactory and from the oropharynx for taste. Primary motor cortex gives rise to the corticospinal tract and the corticobulbar tract. And there are secondary motor areas in the frontal lobe, and there are association areas, primarily in the occipital and parietal and temporal areas, and these are associated with the various sensory cortical areas, the primary sensory cortex, and they're involved in higher order processing of those primary sensory inputs and merging those various sensory inputs. And then there are limbic areas that deal with emotion, cognition, and memory. For several of these functions, there are well-defined functional maps. The primary motor cortex is in the precentral gyrus is among the most prominent, and that provides the final pathway for motor cortical outflow from the corticospinal and corticobulbar pathways. The corticobulbar going to the brainstem, corticospinal going to the spinal cord. The secondary motor areas include an area that is defined as Broca's area. It is the opercular and triangular region, and it's involved in speech production. The frontal eye fields just anterior to the motor cortex, precentral gyrus just anterior to the head area, are the frontal eye fields involved in voluntary horizontal gaze or saccades to the opposite side. And also anterior to the precentral gyrus are the pre and supplementary motor cortex. They're involved in planning and development of movement strategy. And then the far frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex, involved in cognitive functions, judgment, emotions, inhibition, as well as limbic associations. These are all located in the frontal cortex. And then in the rest of the brain, we see primarily sensory information, and includes the primary sensory cortex in the postcentral gyrus. And it's involved with sensation from the body and the head, that is pain and temperature, proprioception, two-point discrimination, and vibratory sense. The pathways that you would know as the spinal thalamic pathway that then comes up to the cortex, as well as the dorsal column lemniscal pathway. And there are also olfactory, auditory, visual, and taste information that comes to the brain, to the cortex. Secondary sensory association areas are largely located in the parietal lobe, and that includes the superior parietal and inferior parietal lobules. It's an association cortex. They're involved in body image, spatial awareness of where your various limbs are in your body, where your body is relative to external space. And then Wernicke's area, which is involved in language comprehension, the understanding of language, the ability to read. And then the occipital eye fields that are involved in visual form recognition, color identification, and the identification of movement. We see here now some of those functions located on the brain and mapped out appropriately. And that is on the precentral gyrus, we see the leg, arm, and head area. On the postcentral for movement of the leg, arm, or head. And for the postcentral gyrus, we see somatosensory input to the leg, to the arm, and to the head, and to the intervening spots along this postcentral gyrus. We see the frontal eye fields just anterior to the head area, and we see Broca's area for speech, expressive language anterior to the face as well. And then we see the premotor cortex anterior to the precentral gyrus, and another area known as the supplementary motor cortex that's closer to the midline, anterior to the leg area. And then we see the prefrontal cortex involved in cognition, in judgment, and emotion. this entire anterior portion of the brain is largely devoted to motor function until you get to the precentral gyrus, the prefrontal cortex. More posteriorly, we've said we've had primary somatosensory cortex. We have association cortex, as we've described in the parietal lobe. We have visual cortex and visual information represented in the occipital cortex. And we have Wernicke's area located in the posterior portion of the superior temporal gyrus. And it extends in this region. And we also see primary auditory cortex a little more anteriorly in the superior temporal gyrus, and much of it is buried on the and deep in the fissure, providing auditory information. The cerebellum is involved in motor coordination, as we'll discuss later in the course. Notice that most of the back of the brain is involved in sensory information. The frontal lobe has, as we've said, the superior, middle, and inferior temporal gyrus, with the inferior temporal gyrus separated into triangular, opercular, and orbital frontal cortex. And these triangular and opercular areas are associated with motor language in left hemisphere in most people. And damage to that region interferes with speech, while damage to the right hemisphere may not interfere with speech significantly. It's referred to as Broca's area, and it's involved in motor speech production or expressive language, and to some significant extent to writing as well. The precentral gyrus is the primary motor area, and its output, as we've indicated, is the corticospinal and corticobulbar tracts. It activates contralateral motor neurons in the spinal cord and in the brainstem. And there is a somatotopy to that precentral gyrus that we refer to as the motor homunculus. And then the most anterior regions of the frontal lobe are termed the prefrontal cortex, anterior to the motor structures and premotor areas. And some of the premotor areas include the supplementary motor cortex and the frontal eye fields, more inferior. The parietal lobe is posterior to the central sulcus, possesses the postcentral gyrus, as well as the superior and inferior parietal lobules, and together they're known as the posterior parietal association cortex. The postcentral gyrus is the primary somatosensory cortex, and it possesses an inverted representation of the sensory homunculus for the contralateral side of the body, as we'll see shortly. And that is with the head on the most inferior portion of the postcentral gyrus and the leg on the most superior portion. The supramarginal and angular gyrus are part of the inferior parietal lobules, and they receive input from multiple sensory areas, including somatosensory, auditory, and visual input for processing and merging information from many different types of sensory information. We see here the homunculus. On the left, we see the motor homunculus. On the right, in the precentral gyrus. On the right, we see the sensory homunculus in the primary somatosensory cortex. The relative size of the parts of the body that are shown in this distorted figure indicate the amount of cortex devoted to that particular part of the body, so that for motor function, we see that there's a particularly large amount of cortex devoted to movement of the lips and of the fingers, particularly the index finger and the thumb. Similarly, on the sensory cortex, the amount of size of the homunculus, distorted representation on the homunculus, reflects the amount of cortex, the amount of neurons devoted to the sensation of that part of the body. So there's an enormous amount of tissue devoted to the face and to the lips, and to the thumb and the fingers, particularly the thumb and the index fingers. That means that we have much finer resolution of touch in the fingers and the face, and we have much finer movement of the lips and the tongue and of the fingers than we do other parts of the body. And you can see the trunk has a very small representation, so that you don't have very fine control of muscles in those regions, and the same in the leg. So the representation, the amount of tissue devoted to each function, is reflected in these homunculi. The temporal lobe has three major gyri. We can see those on the lateral surface of this left temporal lobe, superior, middle, and inferior temporal lobe. And the primary auditory cortex is located just at the top of the superior temporal gyrus in a deep portion of this fissure in an area known as Heschel's gyrus. And then further posteriorly, we see Wernicke's area, the receptive language area responsible for language. For the vast majority of people, this is located in the left hemisphere. We also see the frontal eye fields represented over here. If we look at a mid-sagittal view, we now have a better appreciation of the separation of the occipital cortex from the parietal cortex because we can see the parietal occipital notch. And if you follow this around laterally, you'll see that it separates a little less clearly the occipital and parietal lobe. We also see the primary visual cortex, which is located right along the calcarine fissure. And we also see the parasential lobule, which is the medial extension of the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus. In this case, representing the foot and the leg for sensation and the foot and the leg for movement. We also see the cingulate cortex. This is a portion of the limbic system and is involved in emotion and in pain. We see the thalamus, a little bit deeper. It's a relay station for sensory information coming up from the spinal cord and from the brainstem before it travels on to the cortex. And we also see the hypothalamus immediately below the thalamus. It's involved in homeostasis, endocrine control, and limbic functions. On this basal surface of the brain, we can see the orbital frontal cortex and the temporal lobe, which merge into the occipital lobe. And key structures we can see on the temporal lobe is the parahippocampal gyrus. Deep to this structure, the parahippocampal gyrus, is the hippocampus. This region is critically involved in memory formation, especially for the development of new memories. And then just medial to the parahippocampal gyrus, we can see the uncus, that little bump on the medial surface of the temporal lobe, and that receives olfactory information. And right along between the uncus and the parahippocampal gyrus, we can see the tentorial notch. It's a little groove. That's the location of the tentorium that we described earlier that separates the temporal and occipital cortex from the cerebellum. And at this location, the temporal lobe bulges right up against that tentorial notch. And if there happens to be a swelling of this tissue in the temporal lobe due to a tumor or a hemorrhage, then it can push this tissue, the uncus, into the nearby brainstem. Pushing on the nearby brainstem can compromise brainstem functions, which includes both motor functions as well as critically central portions of the brainstem are involved in consciousness, and pressing on this tissue can produce unconsciousness or coma. We can see the tentorium cerebelli right here, and the tentorial notch is right in this region, and that pressing temporal lobe over this tentorial notch would push it into the brainstem. We can see that also on this coronal section showing the brainstem and the temporal lobe, and the tentorium cerebelli is sitting right here with the uncus right here. So if this region has some swelling in it due to a stroke, a hemorrhage, a tumor that pushes this tissue over, it can push onto the brainstem and cause problems in brainstem function. We see here a mid-sagittal view of the brainstem, and it shows a number of structures we'll want to get familiar with. And we'll start up here, and we're in the region of the thalamus and the hypothalamus and the third ventricle, sits right around the thalamus. The third ventricle has CSF that runs through the cerebral aqueduct into the fourth ventricle, and from the fourth ventricle out through the foramen of Magendie or the foramen of Monroe. The foramen of Magendie is at the midline, and it's one of the outflows of cerebral spinal fluid. We also see various portions of the brainstem, the midbrain here, and on the top of the midbrain, we see the midbrain tectum. And the midbrain tectum includes the superior and inferior colliculi, two different bumps that we'll see on the midbrain. And then below the midbrain, we see the pons and a very large basis pontus. And then inferior to the pons, we see the medulla. And below the medulla, the spinal cord. And behind the pons, we see the cerebellum and portions of the outer portions of the cerebellum that are referred to as the vermis. We can see the tentorium cerebelli is sitting right here between the cerebellum and the occipital lobe. This region is a very narrow region that we identified between the third and the fourth ventricle called the cerebral aqueduct or the aqueduct of Sylvius. Right above that is this tectum, and right above the tectum is the midbrain, is the pineal gland. The pineal gland is sometimes subject to tumorous growth, and if you had tumorous growth here, it would push down on the tectum, which would push down on the aqueduct, which would block cerebral spinal fluid from going out this way and produce a condition known as hydrocephalus, which can be a very serious life-threatening condition. There are three divisions of the brainstem: the midbrain, pons, and medulla. And the functions include, including cranial nerves, both motor and sensory and others, and it's a conduit for major long tracts, corticospinal, spinal thalamic, and medial lemniscus, and for various integrative functions that occur within the brainstem. The cranial nerves are the head's equivalent of spinal nerves, and they tend to be involved in special senses, such as hearing and vestibular activity. As a conduit, it refers to the ascending and descending tract, corticospinal tract and spinal thalamic tract and medial lemniscus. But it also contains some very important integrative functions, those that are involved in cardiorespiratory control, some complex motor patterns, and, very importantly, levels of arousal and consciousness, control of sleep and wakefulness. It's particularly dependent on the brainstem reticular formation, which we'll take a look at later on, which is the central portion of the brainstem. We see here the cranial nerves location on the brainstem, and as you can see, midbrain includes cranial nerve 3 coming out of near the midline, and cranial nerve 4, which comes out on the dorsal surface. It's the only cranial nerve to exit on the dorsal surface of the brainstem. And then as we move down to the pons, we can see in the lateral position cranial nerve 5. As we move to the pontomedullary border, you can see cranial nerve 6, 7, and 8. And then as we move into the medulla, we can see rootlets of cranial nerve 9, 10, and 11 are exiting posterior to the olive. And then cranial nerve 12, which is involved in tongue movement, emerges between the pyramids. This is the medullary pyramid and the olive. If we look here at a blown up section of the brainstem, again we see the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, and we can see the central portion of the brainstem is the tegmentum. It's a general description of the central portion of the brainstem, and we'll see that there are a variety of structures within this tegmentum. We can also see a better view of now the cerebral aqueduct, which is a pathway of cerebrospinal fluid that comes from below the superior and inferior colliculus, which makes up the tectum, and the tegmentum of the midbrain. And we see the cerebella vermis, and at the midline and the cerebella hemisphere more laterally. These superior and inferior colliculi are involved in vision and hearing, respectively. If we look at a ventral view of the brainstem, we now see the cerebral peduncle filled with white matter, and it's also called the crus cerebri, and it's a fiber bundle on the ventral surface of the midbrain. Cranial nerve 3 exits medial to the cerebral peduncle, here and here. The fibers of the peduncle pass into the bassus pons and then reemerge in an organized structure known as the pyramid. This is the medullary pyramid. It's based on the fibers that come through this structure that we call this the pyramidal tract. The corticospinal tract is also known as the pyramidal tract because the fibers come through the pyramids. And then the bassus pons also contains a large number of transverse fibers that enter the cerebellum. The pyramidal decussation at the bottom of the medulla is where fibers travel from one side of the brain over to the other side of the spinal cord to activate muscles on the opposite side from which they originated. And then the olive is just lateral to the pyramid. And in deep structure, it would be identified as the inferior olivary nucleus, and it's involved in connections with the cerebellum. Here is a dorsal view of the brainstem. And now we see some of the cerebellar peduncles, both the superior cerebellar peduncle, the middle cerebellar peduncle, and the inferior cerebellar peduncle. They are the major attachment between the cerebellum and brainstem, and many of those travel up to higher portions of the brain. There are all those, in the superior colliculus we also see here, and the inferior colliculus, as we've indicated, involved in visual and auditory functions. And then just above the superior colliculus, we see the pineal gland. Here we see cross sections of the brainstem, starting out with the midbrain, and we can see the tectum. The colliculi are on the dorsal surface, and then this large central region is referred to as the tegmentum, and we'll identify in the future certain nuclei within there and pathways. And the cerebellar peduncle, which is a collection of fibers, axon fibers, traveling in this region, including the corticospinal tract that travels right here. And then we see the pons, and we see the tegmentum of the pons, which again will have a number of nuclei and tracts that we'll talk about, as well as the bassus pontus, made up largely of the corticospinal tracts that you see these dark fibers coming at us, or rather many of the fibers coming at us, and then the cerebellar fibers that are transverse fibers in this bassus pontus. And then as we move over to the medulla, we can see the dorsal portion is the tegmentum, which again has several nuclei we'll be interested in later on, the inferior olivary nucleus, and the pyramids that carry corticospinal information. If there are any questions about this material, don't hesitate to contact me.